Let's assume the names have been changed to protect the participants. I want to start out by, and I don't have to say this, but I'm going to say this. I adore my wife, Jackie. She dazzles me with her smile. She takes my breath away. And I'd rather spend a lazy afternoon with her than be on any grand adventure I can think of. My life with her over the past 39 years has been a grand adventure. But I lived for 18 years before I knew she was on the planet, or at least before I paid attention to her. Now, this was during those days. Jackie was not in my life, or if she was, then she was this girl that attended this church that I was speaking at, and she hadn't really shown up on my radar yet. But I was home. I was an 18-year-old college student, and I'd come home to visit, and I was going to be visiting at the Oxford congregation, in the little church where I grew up. And because I was coming home and was a college student, they were going to let me be the guest teacher in the teenage Bible class. So I'm standing there in the teenage Bible class, and of course, in those days, you're a ministerial student, so you wore a three-piece suit to church. And I've come into the class, and I've taken off my jacket and hung it on a hook. And I'm standing there in my shirt sleeves and in a vest. And I'm leaning on the podium, and I'm talking to the students, because I knew these students. I'd grown up with them. They knew me as a youth minister up the road at 25th and Noble. But I'd known the students in this room. I knew their older brothers and sisters. And so they knew who I was, and I'm standing there casually in front of the room, getting ready to start my Bible class. And late to class, the door opens. It's a corner-fed room, and the door swings open, this little hardwood door and these paneled walls of the Oxford Church of Christ church building, and in walks a stunningly attractive young lady. And she walked into the room, and I was stunned, and I gathered myself together. I said, "Hi, my name's Lonzo." And she giggled, and she said, "I know who you are. My name is Amanda." No, it can't be. Alarms began to go off in my head. It was like in the pantry of my brain, a gallon jar of relish had rocked and fallen off the top shelf and hit the floor and splattered. My mom used to babysit this girl, and her name was Mandy. And she was all knees and elbows and freckles. She had red hair, and she looked like Pippi Longstocking, who had a 5-year meth habit. What walked into the door of this classroom was not that girl. This was a very poised young lady with auburn hair in a sophisticated ensemble of wool, silk, and high heels. Oh boy, I had some serious repentance to do. Well, after class, I sort of made some kind of reference that seeing as we're old friends and we've known each other since we were kids, why don't we go have lunch together? And so she drove home and I drove home. And then after church, I picked her up at her house and we went to lunch. And after lunch, I went to her house and was visiting and sitting there in the parlor and talking with her family. And her mom encouraged her to show me her fencing stuff. Well, apparently this sophisticated young lady that I had known before by a different name was in some kind of a classical education, and she has a complete set of fencing equipment. She had foils or an épée or a saber. She had the mask that you put on. And so looking at this stuff, and she sort of teasingly said, "Would you like to duel?" Now, these are the days before I knew anything about Inigo Montoya. I did not know that famous swordsman ever existed. And the only reference I had for fighting with a blade came from Zorro, Zeb McCahan with a Bowie knife, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. So she hands me this little teeny tiny skinny sword called a foil or an épée, and then she gives me this mask that looks kind of like the difference between a gas mask and a beekeeper's mask, but it has this mesh that completely covers your face. Now, what's behind this mask? I could hear my own breathing. And so out of my 3 options for sword fighting, Zeb McCahan went the way of the world. I wasn't going to be able to do Zorro because that's probably what she was trained to do with anyway. And so I chose the Dark Lord of the Sith. She donned her mask, She stepped back and she adopted this very elegant position. It looked like a combination between a ballet dancer and a ninja. And she extended this little sword with one hand, raised her other hand behind her head, and she said, "En garde." Enguarde, I think, and that is French for on guard. They sound a lot alike. I grab my sword and mimic a two-handed grasp, and I hold this little sword vertical in front of my nose, and when she said on guard, I said, "You should not have come here, Obi-Wan." And then it was off. So what I did was I took the sword in a false grip and I rotated it forward and I did one flourish. I did a complete, I think they call it a false grip or a broken wrist, and I twirled the sword in Jedi fashion. I brought it back up to my face. I feinted at her forehead, and when she went to parry, I sidestepped and came around with a full spinning back fist, and it would have cleaved her in half had it been a true lightsaber. It turns out that the lightsaber technique from a science fiction movie against the Italian-French tradition-influenced fencer is about like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu against a kid who plays WWE on his Xbox. I was clearly the victor. Well, my victory resulted in me being simultaneously laughed at, called a cheater, and a barbarian. I was accused of cheating and being a barbarian, and I actually thought I'd made a pretty decent showing of being a Jedi. Turns out that fencing has lots of rules. In one particular style of fencing, you can only touch your opponent with the tip end of the foil. And if you're fighting without a referee and you get touched, you're supposed to yell, "Touché," which signifies that you've been touched. It turns out fencing is not about cleaving limbs off or cutting someone in half. It's about taking the very end of the foil and scoring points by touching the scoring areas, the face, the neck, or the body. So when you realize that fencing is this elegant, gentle, semi-contact sport, the term barbarian probably wasn't judgy after all. But in my mind, I could hear Ben Kenobi say, "This is the weapon of the Jedi. Not as clumsy or random as a blaster. An elegant weapon from a more civilized age." But his words seemed a little moot at that point. Later on, I would read an article about the whole Star Wars stuff, and it was sort of in the vein of what they said versus what they meant or what they didn't say. And so in that very first scene of the very first movie, when Ben Kenobi gives Luke Skywalker the sword that belongs to his father, really what he should have said is, "This is your father's lightsaber. I stole it from him when I amputated his 3 remaining limbs and left him to burn alive in a volcano. Now you can have it." That's probably closer to reality and probably fits the style of sword fighting I was doing versus this young lady who was Italian-French trained as a fencer. Well, regardless of the sword fighting debacle, I'm immensely glad that Mandy became Amanda. She was not stuck in the image I had of her when she was immature, and I was more immature. A boy making fun of this gangly girl that would come over to my house and be babysat by my mom. And I'm glad I did not remain the person that some people saw me as when I was an adolescent or a young adult or a clueless minister or a novice husband, when I was immature and headstrong and conceited and self-absorbed rather than self-aware. I'm glad that there are other people in my life who could recognize what I could become and did not box me into what I was at the moment in time that they crossed swords with me. And as important as it is to see people and what they can become rather than what they are, or to realize where they can go rather than just where we meet them, I think it's important to give ourselves the exact same grace. You don't have to stay that person. You don't have to stay angry. You don't have to stay hurt. You don't have to stay injured. You don't have to stay weak. You don't have to stay depressed. You don't have to stay addicted. You don't have to stay anxious. You don't have to stay guilty. Being able to change, being able to grow. Growth and change are intentional. They are not accidental, and they are available. We don't have to stay in that image that people assign to us based on either their accurate or inaccurate memories. The idea that we are who we are is who we'll always be. The idea that where we are is always going to be where we will be, that's living with the absence of help. That's living with the absence of worth. That's living with the absence of hope. People who think that who they are is who they'll always be and where they are is where they'll always be, they don't believe that they have any help or worth or hope. They are guilty of being helpless, worthless, and hopeless. Now, people who believe they are helpless believe they have no resources. People believe they are worthless, believe they have no value, and people who have no hope believe they have no future. In locking ourselves or even locking other people into this mindset of this is how you are and this is how you'll always be, this is where you are and this is where you will always be, robs us and robs them of recognizing their resources, their worth, and their future. You see, once you recognize you have a future, once you recognize that we have a future, then we have the ability to think different, act different, and become different. I am expires or can expire when today becomes yesterday and tomorrow becomes today. See, as today becomes yesterday, I am can become I was or I used to be or I will no longer be. And even in the case of something like depression, you may not be able to not be depressed, but you can choose how to respond to the depression. And it's not that we throw this magical light switch and say, there, I'm no longer depressed. But we decided that the way we've been living with depression doesn't have to be the way we continue to live with depression. Or for that matter, the way we continue to live with guilt or shame or anger or hurt or addiction or resentment or being a person who happens to have failed at something. You see, help, worth, and hope. The future is not always controlled by our past. Help, hope, and worth, resources, value, and future are not always controlled by external forces either. We have the ability to change our futures. We have the ability to change our futures looking from our past to our present and then looking to our potential. And actually, that's largely involved in simply how we deal with ourselves. It's not how we let other people's view of us affect us. It's not how we let other people's opinion of us affect us. It's not how we let other people's opinions of us protect us or even their memories of us. You see, it really boils down to dueling with ourselves. Now, once you enter into the duel, it's very important to understand the rules of engagement. That's part of the deal in dueling with this girl who was Mandy, who became Amanda, is that she had a fencing sword and I pretended mine was a lightsaber, and we didn't understand the rules of engagement. And understanding and recognizing the rules of engagement is the expectations is super essential. Fencing apparently has way different rules than lightsaber fighting. And I would say that the majority of the issues that I deal with when I talk to people in conflict or I talk to people in crisis, I even talk to people in grief or depression, it basically is the idea that expectation and reality did not match. And that doesn't matter if I'm dealing with somebody's marriage, dynamics in dealing with a church congregation, in business negotiations and leadership skills, or even in intrapersonal skills. The issue boils down to expectation, and expectation did not meet reality. We thought the rules were this. We thought the end was this. We thought our obligations were this. I thought my role was this. And it turns out that I did what I thought was okay, and then I get accused of being inferior or cheating or being a barbarian. You don't have to, and you never will have to, live up to other people's expectations as long as you set the expectations for yourself first. See, you don't have to live up to my own expectations, and what do the rules say? Do the rules say you didn't, so you can't ever? Do the rules say you did, so you always will? Do the rules say you don't have and therefore you can never have, achieve, or acquire? That's a bad set of rules to live by. In understanding that if those are the rules you've been living by, those aren't good rules, those aren't valid rules, those aren't healthy rules. You see, the rules of engagement affect how you play. The rules of engagement affect how you fight. The rules of engagement are things that we treat ourselves like we are playing Monopoly with a 4-year-old. That is to say, we apply rules to everybody else, but they don't apply to us. Or worse, the unfair rules we applied to other people end up being applied to ourselves. See, if I'm a person who doesn't forgive other people, I don't forgive myself. If I'm a person who thinks other people can't be forgiven, then by default, I can't be forgiven. It's important to make sure that the rules we applied to ourselves are fair and right and just and compassionate. Because if we don't apply these things to us, we will not apply those graces to other people. In the end, the assumption that we have a healthy self-rules is contained in this simple philosophy. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Now, if the treatment we apply to others is not the treatment we'd apply to ourselves, then the rules we have are unfair, the rules we have are unjust, and the rules are unhealthy. So in order to get past our past and find our potential, we have to be willing to allow ourselves the grace to change. We have to allow ourselves the grace to understand that the rules that we want applied to other people, we should apply to ourselves. And if the rules we apply to ourselves are hurtful to other people, then we're probably being hurtful to ourselves. Winning this battle with getting past your past, living into your present, and achieving your potential, in the end, that's a battle where we end up really actually dueling with our selves.